So thank you for coming, everyone. And those of you who are on Zoom, we are happy to have Dariusz Kołodziejczyk with us. This is the first MENA seminar of the department. Professor Dariusz Kołodziejczyk is professor of early modern history at the University of Warsaw and at the Polish Academy of Sciences. He has published extensively on the Ottoman Empire, the Crimean Khanate, Christian-Muslim relations, and the imperial frontiers. He is currently president of CIEPO, which is an organization of scholars who study pre-Ottoman and Ottoman history, member of the European Academy, and honorary member of the Turkish Historical Society. He has been visiting professor at the University of Notre Dame, Hokkaido University, and the Collège de France. His current project focuses on the presence of Central Eastern Europeans in Asia, especially in the frameworks of the Jesuit order and the Dutch East India Company, and on the role of Central and Eastern Europe in early modern globalization. He has published extensively on Polish and Ottoman relations. He has monographs, he has source publications. These include the Crimean Khanate and Poland-Lithuania, international diplomacy on the European periphery, 15th through 18th centuries. One of his most recent, although even that is more than 10 years ago. It was published 10 years ago. More recently, co-edited several volumes like Universal Empire, a comparative approach to imperial culture and representation in Eurasian history, and the relations of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Safavid Iran. So please, Dariusz.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I will divide this presentation in two parts. So in the first, I will tell you where is Hotin. Provide some historical background and tell you about the archive, because the story of this archive is fascinating. So, and then in the second part, I will go into some tasty details, case studies relating to border crossing or people who were. So Hotin is, as you can see, it's on the former Polish-Ottoman border in northern Moldavia, but this part was taken by the Ottomans in the early 18th century. Today it's in the Ukraine, about 30 kilometers from Kamieniec-Podolski, the Kamanice, very important Podolian fortress that was conquered by the Ottomans in 1672. And you see Hotin here. It's a very good picture taken from a drone. The medieval castle of Hotin was built in the 14th century. It was then taken by the Ottomans, but then many times restored to Moldavia. But it was useless already in the 17th century. So actually, when you have two great battles of Hotin, the second Hotin Safari or campaign of 1621, and then the famous victory of Jan Sobieski, the future king of Poland, of 1673, both these campaigns of Hotin took place not in the fortress, but actually there were earth fortifications that were much larger. And you see the 18th century shape. What you see is the real fortification of Hotin in the 18th century are much larger than this small medieval castle. So after the Prut campaign, actually already after the Karlovic Treaty, the Ottomans looked for a replacement of the lost fortress of Kamanice that would serve to secure the loyalty of the Moldavian and even Wallachian Palatines, the loyalty of the Crimean Khans, and some control over the northern border, both with Poland, Lithuania, but also with Russia. So you have Tsar Peter the Great, who enters the Ottoman territory in 1711, and in the treaty, the Edirne Treaty of 1713, we have already written that the Ottomans forced the Russian side to engage, that they would take their hand from Poland. You have this Turkish expression, left memlekatin külliyet ile el çeker. So you have fully take your hand from Poland. So the Ottoman Empire becomes a kind of guarantor of the neutrality of Poland-Lithuania against Russia. And even in the Polish-Ottoman document from 1714, Poland was forced actually to accept this part of the Russian-Ottoman treaty. So Poland lost its full agency already in the early 18th century. It became a kind of buffer state. And exactly after this campaign of Peter the Great, the Ottomans separated Hotin from Moldavia. They created a small district, Nahie, which was converted into a sanjak, a larger province, by 1727. We don't know precisely the date, but already there's a document from 1727 when we have the sanjak of Hotin. And this fortress was conquered by Field Marshal von Munich, by the Russian troops in August 1739. What is interesting for us, the Russians packed the whole archive and brought it to Moscow. So we have over 3,000 documents of the Hotin archive. It is, to my knowledge, it is the largest provincial Ottoman archive in the world. So you can write many PhDs based on the Hotin archives, on the administration, on the garrison, on everyday life, many things, border reality, and so on. There's the Russian plan taken precisely after the conquest of Hotin in 39. So you see that more or less this reflects what you saw on the picture on the photograph. A short history of Hotin after that. It was restored very shortly by the force of the Treaty of Belgrade. It was lost again during the so-called Polish War, and then restored by the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca. It was lost again in 1788, again restored in 92, Treaty of Jassy, and finally lost in 1806 and not restored. It became a part of Russia. It belonged to Romania short time before the Second World War, and then it was Soviet Ukraine. Today it's in the Ukraine. Well, the archive is very interesting. The archive already, we can trace the archive already 1749 in the Moscow archive of the Council of Foreign Affairs. It was then the main Moscow archive that was divided in 1940s in the Soviet times. It's very important for present-day historians of Russia because the documents that are older than 1720, the so-called Collegian reform by Peter, are in Rgada, and Rgada is user-friendly. You have many friends there. You can either microfinance legally or illegally. Anyway, you can do many things there. The second part went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it became a very difficult, hardly accessible thing. Even worse, some documents that are from the 17th century and should go to Rgada, they are in fact in the mid, because in the times of Vyacheslav Molotov or the Truman Doctrine, some documents were still regarded as important for the Soviet foreign policy. So you have a catalog, 19th century handwritten catalog with a note. It's the confirmation of the Treaty of Bakhchisarai of 1681, definitely before the Peter's Collegian reform, and it was transferred to the archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the rules in this, so today in the archive of the Foreign Affairs, it's today named Archiv Wnietrznej Polityki Rosyjskiej Imperii, so the archive of the foreign policy of the Russian Empire. It's still the part of the foreign ministry of the Russian Federation. And then you have this font. It was written in the catalog that is about 2,500 documents. The time covered, in fact, more. But the problem, I visited this archive 2 times before. The rule was you could order 5 units per week. And if you have 3,000 units, you can count it's about 10 years necessary to live in Moscow for 10 years. So I gave up. I wrote that maybe the future generation will go there. It was hardly encouraging. And a breakthrough was in April 2016. The director of the Chernihiv local museum in Ukraine wrote a letter to the Polish Ministry of Culture. And my former student worked there, so he knew whom to address. And they proposed that there is something in the Chernihiv, in the local museum. There are a few hundred of letters of the Polskich Panów, so the Polish lords to the Pasha of Hotin. So I immediately thought that it must be a part of the Hotin archive of Kolchak Pasha. And it was true. When you look at this map, it seems that Chernihiv is in the mid, on the road from Hotin to Moscow. But when you examine these documents, it's not that these are documents that fell from the card. It is not accidental, because when we today have gathered the Polish documents, and only part are in Polish, because most of the documents are in Ottoman Turkish, but you have almost 800 letters in Polish. So the letters that are to Pasha are mostly in Chernihiv, and they are of political contents. The letter of much less political contents, not to the Pasha, but to his secretary, about like buying watches, lemons, whatever, and watermelons, it's in the left. So apparently they selected documents that were important politically, and probably these documents were preserved in Kiev. And the rest of the archives went to Moscow because they were either in Turkish, who can read in Turkish, or in Polish, but about watermelons, it doesn't matter. So this political thing is today in the Ukraine. They gave us full access to this document. So we decided, okay, we can try again. Let's try with the foreign ministry. And it worked. The result is this publication. It was published just less than 1 year ago. I proposed a younger colleague. He was a PhD student, and he's now a full doctor, Mariusz Kaczka. And it's the addition of about 400 letters in Polish to the Ottoman Pasha. There are also a few letters in Latin written by Hungarian refugees, the supporters of Ferenc and Joseph Rákóczi. Okay, and today in Moscow, I returned to Moscow. It is better today because they have only 27 units. They reorganized the documents. You still can order only 5 per week, but 5 out of 27 makes more sense than 5 out of 3,000. So in several visits between 2017 and 2020, the last visit was shortly before the COVID, I was able to see almost all these documents. The first visit was with Mariusz, but then I was going alone. So what I'm going to say today is mostly based on the entire archive, not only on the Polish letters that are preserved in partly in Chernihiv, partly in Moscow. So there are many very interesting documents that do not belong to the Hotin archive, but they were probably by mistake assembled together. So when the Russians had some fortress taken, some documents collected in Ottoman, they put it in the Kolchak Pasha. So for instance, you have the Ottoman documents from Azov or from Azov that was taken in 1696. So this Pasha archive is also in the Kolchak Pasha. You have many Crimean documents, including 2 treaty instruments, Sol and Ahname, that were considered to be lost since the 19th century. I found them by accident, just squeezed in the Kolchak Pasha archive with nice tugra. One is with nice tugra. Letters by the commander of Janissaries in Orkales, in Perekop, part of the archive of Ochakiv. Many documents from the Cossack Hetmanate, very interesting for Ukrainian historians, from the time of Doroshenko, later Samoilowicz, Ivan Mazepa. And the last document is a Ferman of Sultan Mahmud ordering the border exchange, the Mübadele, between the embassy that ratified the Treaty of Belgrade. So it's 1740. And the documents that do originate from the Kolchak Pasha archive, so you see many categories: the Fermans by the Sultan, letters of the Grand Viziers, letters of the Crimean Khans, of the Moldavian and Wallachian hospodars in Turkish. And a very interesting person we worked with, also we discussed with Ali Agioğlu, Mehmet Emin Aga. He appears to be a very important broker in the finances of the empire, a network person. He was also an overseer of the imperial mint, so the Darbkhane Emini. So he was an important person and a kind of representative of the Pasha against the Poles. So he was sending some confidential letters, giving advice what you should do, what your enemies here are doing, conspiring against you. Very interesting stuff. And also letters of neighboring governors, couriers and diplomats, including the Ottoman envoys sent to Poland and to Sweden, who passed through Hotin. Many letters of Marquis de Villeneuve, the French ambassador in Istanbul, in Turkish, but they are mostly the French embassy used the Ottoman courier system. It was very efficient, very fast. So most French correspondents between Warsaw and Constantinople actually used the services of the Hotin, of the Pasha of Hotin, who provided his ulams. And what is very interesting, and I will focus more on that, is that the complaints of the inhabitants of Hotin including collective complaints of the peasants against the Janissaries, or some lone women. So I remember a woman named Fatma writes to the Pasha, "Now my husband is serving as a chabush in the Hotin. He doesn't send me any money. He doesn't send me any letters. I have children to support. So please," there's a nice conclusion of the letter, "please force my husband either to send me money and a letter that he cares, or the divorce letter." So you have like, so we don't know how it ended, but we have this kind of stuff. And there are also many defters registered concerning the salary payments, provisioning of the fortress. So Gabor knows, is an expert of this stuff. And Ottoman Turkish translators of letters and reports coming from Poland to Lithuania. So apart from Polish letters, in Polish, we have also Turkish translations of letters that were sent from Poland. Well, Ilyas Kolchak Pasha is a fascinating personage. We can trace his career. So Jon Nekulce, the Moldavian chronicler, suggests that he was a Serbian convert from Bosnia. He was not a Romanian. So in internet, you can find a lot of bullshit in internet. Wikipedia, I use myself Wikipedia, but not for Kolchak Pasha. So he was apparently a Slav, and because he knew Polish, he spoke Polish, he wrote Polish, he signed his name in Polish. Usually his letters are signed by his secretary, but there is one letter that is by himself, and we can see his character. It's his own handwritten signature in Polish there. Ilyas Pasha, Kolchak Pasha, Saraskier na Hotiniu. And then he was involved in the war against the Habsburgs. He was already in Hotin, in the service of Hotin, when the fortress was founded by the Ottomans. And then he was involved in a anti-Habsburg guerrilla activity by Hungarian refugees. So we have Adam Jaworka, who was one of his correspondents, was a follower of Francis Rákosi. He was a sole Agassi. So actually, there is a Gika chronicle who refers to him as sole called Agassi, but in Ottoman documents from the same time use the Sa Agassi, and in Polish he is also called Savkul, which is rather the Aga of the right and not of the left wing of the local cavalry. Then it's very interesting. I couldn't read it myself. By Brzeziński, there's a document from 1729, but when you read Ottoman chronicles, you see that this Przezeń is Prizren. It's a big, important town in Kosovo, present-day Kosovo. So he was still serving in Hotin, but he was awarded the province of Prizren to get some money. It was not called Arpaleg, but it's like Arpaleg. So his stipend was from this province. Oh, now it doesn't work. Oh, sorry. Okay, it works. Too fast, maybe. Okay, in 1730, he becomes the governor of Hotin with 2 horsetails. You have the letter by the Grand Vizier Nefrahirli Ibrahim Pasha. And at the same time, he also obtained the Sanjak of Janina in Epirus, which is very unusual because it was typical that border commanders were given extra income somewhere in central Bulgaria. But Janina was itself an important place strategically. We know that later Ali Pasha, the famous Monte Cristo Dumas hero. So it suggests that Janina was perhaps not that important in the early 18th century still. So he tries to combine post. He doesn't go to Janina. But then in 1736, he becomes a vizier and a pasha with 3 horsetails. The hostile is in Ottoman, it was bunchuk, but it was rather the term that was used was tool. So we have the Polish term that nobody in Poland would understand today is dwójtulny or trzytulny. So the pasha of 3 plugs, the pasha of 3 hostails. And he became this largest, highest honor in 36. After the surrender of Hotin, Kolchak was sent to Kiev, then to St. Petersburg. He was released in 41. He was restored on his position, so he was not punished for the surrender of Hotin, but he died shortly after. There was some gossip about poison, but I'm not sure about it. There's just one letter, and it's like a gossip. And there are fake news in Wikipedia that he went to Poland, that he entered the service of the Polish hetman, and he died in 43. We have documents that show that he died in 41. We know something about his family. Some of the Polish correspondents really knew his family. His two sons, his older son became later the governor of Hotin after his father. He initially lost the competition with the son of the first Ottoman governor of Hotin. So you see, we have two fathers who are the governors, and then there's a competition for the post between the sons of these two fathers. So initially, young Kolchak lost, but then in 2 years, in 43, he is already the Pasha of Hotin, and he writes a letter to a Polish important noble. He signed Ahmed Kolchak Pasha Ochimski. There is even some information about his wife, and there's probably the letter written by his mother. I showed it also to Leslie Pierce. We discussed whether it can be because there's a woman who writes that she is Zawjay al-Haji Baba, and she titles him Oğlum, but in Turkey, an older woman can title my son also any younger male, but still she writes that she feels alone, and so it can be either a mother or a female relative. So there's one letter, perhaps maybe by his mother. And you have very interesting instruction regarding Kolchak Pasha and his role on the border. So for instance, Hekimoğlu Ali Pasha, the Grand Vizier, ordered him to be an eye and an ear that follows all developments in the surrounding and the border. So etraf ve knafe çeşme gush olup. So he should be this eye and ear. And we have letters from almost 100 Polish-Lithuanian correspondents. Some of the letters are not preserved in Polish, but we have only Turkish translations, like for Stanisław Leszczyński, actually the king of one of the kings during the Polish the war of Polish succession. And probably these most important letters were sent to Istanbul along with the translation. So what we have today is probably only a part. It might be not a tip of the iceberg, but some of the most important letters, there were probably more letters than we have today. Among 337 letters in Polish that we know the authors, over one half were penned by just 18 authors. So you can see who are these authors. They are mostly the military commanders or the palatines of the southeastern palatinates of Poland, Lithuania, Kiev, Volhynia, Podolia, Lublin, and border judges. It's very interesting because they also solve many personal conflicts. So you have two border judges, Świerski and Woroniecki. This was a slide prepared by Mariusz Kaczka. I had problems with animation. I switched off. So we have military officers, we have dignitaries, we have diplomats, but also priests, also women, especially landowners, female landowners. And sometimes there's a woman, the husband is somewhere, he went to Radom or to Warsaw. So she's writing to the Pasha, trying to solve elements. And now, well, the political, I'm not going to speak about politics today, but some just short background. Most of the letters origin, in general, we have covered the period 1730 to 1739, but over one half of these letters out of a 3-year period that was between the royal election of Stanisław Leszczyński and the beginning of the war of the Polish succession and the pacification diet of June 1736 that ended the war of the Polish succession in Eastern Europe. So we know that this war dragged on in Italy, in Western Europe, in Central Europe until 38, but it was actually resolved in 36 in Poland, Lithuania. And 81 letters origin just from 6 months between the entry of the Russian troops into Polish Ukraine and Podolia and the capitulation of Danzig when Leszczyński's loss was really caused, was lost. And we have many reports also concerning the size of movements of Russian troops. And many nobles, most of the nobles, in that time, they try to send their herds, their horses, their families, their movables to the Ottoman side. So we have plenty of letters, like a woman, the wife of the tenant of Żwaniec, who writes, asks the Pasha whether, can you assure that we can be safely here, or you advise us to come over to your side? You have a priest from Mielnica who proposes the hymn and also his parish men and women would come to the Ottoman side. And you have also important Polish nobles who also write about this. We know there was one of the Potockis. He sent his wife to Hotin, and she could be safe under the Ottoman protection. Well, initially, the Poles didn't wish that Tatar auxiliary troops enter Podolia. They suggested that the Tatars invade Russia and not go through. They might be friendly, but they might take something on the road. So, but then when they were really in desperate situation, so Michał Potocki was preparing wooden ferries on the Dniester. So they were really waiting for the Tatars to come and help them. And the capitulation of Brody and Danzig actually solved the military conflict, even though there was a guerrilla war in Podolia until 35. Kamieniec formally acknowledged the rule of August Wettin, or August III, on 1st June 35. So it's kind of irony that when in June the troops of Marshal Mühlich entered Bachchyserai, the Crimea, so in Poland there was already a pacification. So when the Polish supporters of Leszczyński, they wanted the Ottomans very much to attack Russia, but the Ottomans were waiting. And then when the Ottomans were already in the full war against Russia, it was too late to fight in Poland. Actually, this is a motto, this is a part of the letter by Józef Sierakowski to Kolczak Pasha, which sounds not very normal for somebody used to this motto of Antemurale Christianitatis, so the bulwark of Christianity, that although you, our beloved neighbors, didn't want to rescue us from our troubled situation in the ominous times. So he still keeps friendship, but he's kind of disappointed. With some speaking with masks and glasses is a new challenge. Well, so what we have from this collection is a slightly different image of Antemurale Christianitatis. For instance, we can learn that timber, but also limestone, necessary for restoration of the ramparts of Holy Trinity, that was a proud name of the fortress, not fort rather than fortress, that was built under Jan Sobieski during the Great War against the Ottomans. It was really constructed in the 1680s, 1690s. So these ramparts of Holy Trinity were actually built with the Ottoman material, with Ottoman limestone, Ottoman timber. The soldiers are also asking Pasha, please send us some timber. I showed you a map before, and on the map it's shown that the forests were only on the Ottoman side. There are no more forests on the northern side of the Dniester. So when they need timber, they ask the Pasha to provide the timber, also for construction, for heating. We have shopping excursions of Polish nobles and Polish ladies, so who go to Hotin, buy, but also their wives and daughters go, and apparently they go alone even, or with some servants, but not necessarily with their husbands or fathers. And there's one letter when Krzysztof von Lezekan, or Krzysztof Lezekan, he was of Polish origin, but Polish officer, he wrote in Polish, and he writes to the Pasha that my wife with some other ladies would like to visit Hotin tomorrow. So would you allow that she also pays a visit to your wife, as you promised before? So we have really friendly relations. They go to the harem. We know this kind of friendliness from the letters of Lady Montagu, but Lady Montagu was a daughter, she was the wife of the British ambassador, so they were diplomats. Here you have officers, you have military officers on the border, and actually these relations are similar. Florian Schiller, that's very interesting story, kind of amusing, about the aforementioned Mustafa having arrived here with lemons and oranges. There was a Janissary, acted against modesty, custom, and his faith, actually. So the Polish writer accuses this Mustafa of violating the rules of Islam, a proper Muslim how should behave. So first getting heavily drunk, and then at midnight having each other in the household of Her Majesty Mrs. Karwowska, the wife of the Leyton's wife. She was actually the stepdaughter of Krzysztof von Lezekan. So we know that there was no rape there. She escaped to the house of her father, and this Mustafa was relieved and sent to be punished by the Pasha. So in the name of the neighborly friendship, they didn't want to punish him himself. And one of the persons who wanted to to send him back was a local Catholic priest. So actually, the friendly relations should not be disturbed. And female strategies, we have not many of such cases, but there are some cases. So I just selected two cases that I think they show something. The female strategy is to free oneself from an unwanted marriage through conversion. And of course, kind of inspiration is also Eric Dursteler's Renegade Women. Dursteler found in the mostly Venetian archives many cases of such women who were trying to pass the border from one side to another side. And we have Turkini, which is a Turkish female. We know from another letter that she was a wife of Mehmed Pasha, so apparently a Janissary named Mehmed. And she has taken her husband's movables and escaped to the Polish side with the help of a farmhand whom she handed herself over in a lifelong friendship. So it's written in Polish, sama siebie w dożywotnią przyjaźń oddała. So apparently there is some unhappy marriage, there is some maybe love, or this this farmhand who helps her to cross the border. And actually the two Polish correspondents, they write to the Pasha that you know very well that we cannot hand her over back because she is already a Christian. So it's like they both know. So what we can do to make you happy or less unhappy, we can hand over the movables that she took from her husband. So that was probably this settled in this way. So the woman could stay as a Christian on the Polish side. And you have a female, a noble lady named Sławska, who was the wife of Pan Sławski. I read it with my students. There are many things that are covered in silence here. So what we know, there was her husband was in debt. There was a Turkish named Halil, probably, or Ali, and some Armenian merchant who visited her when the husband was away. And somehow they persuaded her to take some movables of the husband, including some jewelry, some thalers you have written also, there's some furs, and go to Hotin. And then either she converted because she wanted, or she was made to convert or forced to convert. So it's written again, she went to the Qadi, and the Qadi initially wanted to send her back. But then he decided, no, she's a Muslim. So again, they try to make an agreement that, well, the best, please send Mrs. Sławska to her husband. But we understand if you cannot do it, so please at least send this. And there is written that 70 florins, there's a chain, a golden chain, and some pearls, and so on. There's a watch. Watches are important because the Pasha is even sending watches to be repaired in Wrocław, or repaired in Breslau, or repaired in Krakow. So he's also renting tents to the nobles. So we have really very lively gift exchange. And in the case that I will go to show, there's a woman who only crossed the material border, not the religious one. It's only an Ottoman document. Well, we know that the document was submitted to the Pasha, and then the Pasha resolved to send it to the local Qadi, to the Muslim judge. That's why it's not in Polish. It's only it's in Ottoman. So there was probably some scribe who wrote it for the guy whose name is Ustian. So he's apparently a Ruthenian. He's a Zimmi. He's not a Muslim. But he writes that for 3 years he had been living in peace with a wife who was like of his condition and suitable for him. They were happy apparently. And then after 3 years, a guy came from the Polish side and said, "This is my wife. I'm going to take her by force. So what is this Ustian proposing to the Qadi? So please ask this woman, so ask this woman which one of the two husbands she prefers." So we don't know what the Qadi did. Actually, like many documents like that, we don't have the solution. And I'm afraid it might be possible that this couple fell victim to the Polish-Ottoman friendship, because this guy was on the one hand, they should have protected their own subject, who was Ustian. On the other hand, they should protect the good neighborliness. So if the Polish side was supporting the Polish subject, probably this woman should be handed over to the former husband. But we don't know how it ended. We have also cases like there's a Jew named Moshko who escaped to the Polish side. he got baptized, he became Anton, but then and he was serving a local priest from Rzeszów, and then he came back. So the priest is writing complaints to the Pasha. We have some border crossers like that. We don't have much about peasants. With such correspondence, no wonder. When we have some information about peasants, it's very often because there is some criminal activity or it goes to the court. So probably it's in the tip of the iceberg. Probably the normal everyday life was much more peaceful, but when we learn something about the peasants, it's related to some criminal stories. So I just showed 3 stories. There's a wife of a soldier from the Polish garrison in Żwaniec who went to work as a service maid, as a maid in Rumel. Rumel was a neighborhood from Hotin, and then she went to Naga Korecki, a Lipka Tatar, a Lithuanian Tatar. There were many Lithuanian Tatars who were living on the Ottoman side, and then she got pregnant by somebody. So she was married by force, and now this poor soldier from Żwaniec is without a wife. The children are without a mother. So the Polish side is asking to hand over this woman. We have also Polish. Not Polish, they are not Polish, they are mostly Ruthenian or Ukrainian Orthodox peasants who go to earn money on the Ottoman side. It's quite popular. They go to earn money. What they do, they very often produce bracha or boza. Bracha is from millet, it's fermented millet, and it's slightly alcoholic, but it's not haram, or not entirely haram. There was discussion between the Ottoman legal specialist authorities whether it's already an alcoholic beverage or not. So it was tremendously popular among the Janissaries because they could claim it's not alcoholic. And we have many Ukrainian peasants going to Hotin to produce this bracha or boza for the Janissaries, but some of them engaged in robbing, in theft, and that's why we have this correspondence, because then the justice comes and they are overheard. They were probably hanged. So these guys tell their whole CV, whole life story, but then probably they were hanged because they were caught. We have also the kind of job recruiters, because we learned from one letter that Tomasz Łastowiecki is a local noble, and he reclaims his own subject who was arrested on the Ottoman side, not because this subject did something wrong, but because another peasant from the same village did something wrong. He was working at the household of a Turk named Pir, so the Ottomans adopted the collective responsibility rule, and this Łastowiecki says that he was stupid, that Pir, this Turk, he was stupid that he didn't check the credits of the credential of the job recruiter there. So it must have been quite widespread, the practice of going to work on the other side. There's one fascinating letter, I don't know much about it. It's in Polish. It's written by a woman who says that she is a widow of a Kalmyk colonel. Well, Kalmyks arrived in Eastern Europe in early 17th century. They're already in Siberia in early 17th century. Then they move on the Volga River. Some of them stay up to today. And we have I was myself working on the first correspondence between the Polish court and the Kalmyks. The Polish court wanted to use the Kalmyk against the Tatar because the Kalmyks were Buddhists. They were not Muslims. But here you have this woman. She writes to the Pasha in Polish. So who was her husband? He was a Kalmyk colonel, but whether he served on the Polish side, if he served on the Polish side, why is she writing to the Pasha of Hotin? So maybe he was working on the Ottoman side, but then why is she writing in Polish? Was the Polish the only common language that a Kalmyk officer and an Ottoman Pasha in the Ottoman service could use? Perhaps yes. So it's quite kind of funny because she asked him to send some gifts, some furs, because she's poor and her daughter is going to get married. So it's just they often people are asking him to send some gifts. The pragmatic use of the language. One of these nobles who were sending herds on the other side is then recalling the story that telling that yes, we we sent these herds to your side because we were afraid of the Muscovite Gyals, so Moskov Keferesi Korkusundan. So the Moscow side is labeled as the Gyals by a Polish author. And my last questions, actually, there's a series of naive questions from this correspondence. It's very often that these authors, the Polish authors, are wishing that God conserve the Pasha in good health, or they ask God to award him. There is one in letter, Janos Ilozsvaj, another Hungarian who writes in Latin, that quotes, Deus er optimus benedicat vitamque. Which God had the authors in mind when they entered the aforementioned greeting? So theologically, their letters are addressed to the Ottoman Pasha. Can an infidel be blessed by God? Did they think about it? Did it matter for them? We are still in 1730s. And vice versa, Kolchak also, when he wrote to his Polish correspondent, he is also invoking supremos in Latin. So it would be again the highest, obviously it's God. Is it Allah? Is it the Christian God? Is it the common God? Do they believe there is a common God between Muslims and Christians? I really don't know. And this is the reality of a borderland. I quote here a sentence from Erich Dursteller. The certainty of faith was often quite weak. The view expressed by Carlo Ginzburg, Fein Miller, Menocchio, that the majesty of God, the Holy Spirit, is to all, to Christians, to Turks, and to Jews. Dursteller proposed that political authorities were tried to demarcate orthodoxy. But here we have even, these are political authorities. The Kolchak Pasha and his Polish correspondent, they are themselves political authorities. He is corresponding with Polish bishops. He is also corresponding with the primate Poland. And they use, not always these terms, but they use this kind of mutual blessings. Or perhaps it's a reflection of a new era that would be attractive to propose that it's already an enlightenment. The first is the term enlightenment is heavily disputable. Second, we can hardly speak about enlightenment in early 18th century Central Eastern Europe. It was coming much later, more gradually. There may be some, we can look for some difference, but until the late 17th century, Ottoman letters sent to Christian rulers ended with a salutatio, Hutimet avakibihu bil khair, which is like in Arabic, may his letter days end with good, which they hoped for his conversion to Islam. And here we have letters sent like 30 years later when they don't invoke any possible conversion. They accept fully the other guy who is a Muslim or the other guy who is a Christian. So is it a problem of time? But if it's a problem of time, we have Abbas of Persia, who was already in early 17th century, alluding with the possibility of his conversion when he met European ambassadors. You have Vladimir Minorski's comment on 17th century Georgians, who commented that Islam sat lightly on their shoulders. I like very much this quotation from Minorski. Is it a problem of borderland? That this is borderland reality and all these limitations are much more fluid, blurred? Or is it a kind of something on the axis of time, chronological? I end with a quotation from Barbara Stolberg-Rillinger in her newest book about Maria Teresa, that is some small detail, but maybe telling that in 1742, so precisely in this time, Maria Teresa resigned from displaying the holy relics in the chamber designated for royal birth giving. So a small, the arch-Catholic, the very religious person, not an enlightened person, who does such a thing. So maybe there is a kind of small secularization in the 18th century. But I'm just putting this question without answer. So thank you very much. I think that's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Open it for questions and maybe get a screen so that if people have questions.
I have a question. With all of these friendly relations in peacetime, what happened in wartime? Did having a friendly relationship in peace affect the way these people interacted when war broke out?
Well, the problem is that there is no war. After the Karlovy Treaty and the partition of Poland, there is no single war. There are some single invasions by the Tatars, but not a real confrontation. So that's really a peaceful century. The 18th century, it was in a kind of boring, maybe perhaps because of that, Polish historians, including myself, have not worked on the 18th century because there are no famous battles, no famous new treaties. So it's the Karlovy Treaty is working. But when you take Russians, Munich takes Hotin, but then he behaves quite chivalry, at least in this case, because he sent all females, including the wife of Kolchak Pasha and his younger son. Kolchak Pasha asked the Russians to send the females to Istanbul, and Munich does it. So there is no this hatred. We know about Suvorov attack of Charkiv, it was 1992. So and there were massacres, there was slaughtering. So is it something changing in this mass warfare? Well, I think that on the Habsburg form, I once wrote a small text about Jan Pasek, one of the most famous Polish memoirists from middle and late 17th century. He didn't participate in the siege of Vienna, but he sent his two nephews, and these nephews commented how irrational are these Germans and Austrians that they are slaughtering Turkish prisoners of war. So I was really amused because with all the stereotypes that we have about Eastern Europe that is fanatic and less tolerant, less rational, and the countries to the west that are more rational and more tolerant. And here you have this Polish noble who cannot understand how irrational these Germans are. And then he explained, well, maybe they suffered so much that they have to react in a way, because what a Polish noble does with Turkish prisoners of war, they are to be redeemed. That is a great business. They have special kind of brotherhoods, mutual guarantees like kefalet, and then you have another noble in the Crimea, and when something wrong happens to you, you can negotiate with your brother who is a Tatar noble, and then you can arrange the redemption. So if you kill a prisoner of war, especially of high standing, you lose money. But you asked about 18th century, and in the 18th century there are no wars between Poland, Lithuania, and the Ottoman Empire. So it's just, and actually Russia is slowly becoming a major enemy for both sides, and most of the correspondents of Kolchak Pasha were anti-Russian supporters. So those who was on the Russian side, they rarely, they also tend to correspond sometimes, but not as often.
Thank you. Anyone from the Zoom meeting would like to? Oh, Ilya sent a question. Which legal systems or courts operated on the borderline? You mentioned Qadis.
Yes, well, you have the Qadi of Hotin, and so I don't have to explain the Qadi of Hotin, and you have the system on the Polish side, like in Kamieniec, there was a Burgrabia, but we have also frontier courts. It presided at the same time, because in the same time there was also a Russian Ottoman frontier court. So they have this, it was established after the Treaty of Karlovy. So it's hard to say how often they met. They should have met at least like twice a year. Sometimes they write that we were coming, and they were solving together. So they were the representatives of the Pasha of Hotin and the representative of the Polish side. You have these two persons, the Świrski and Woroniecki. They were sędzia pograniczny. They signed themselves as a border judge, and they solved all cases that involved both the conflict between both sides, the subject of both sides. And also sometimes the Pasha could send simply his agent, his Lipka Tatar, to solve on the spot some conflict. But we have formal courts, and in Russia there is a special collection in the same archive that I described, this name Retranżamenta, Komisja Retranżamenta, which is beautiful. I never worked in this. It's probably another life story to do it, but there are border commissions between Russia and the Ottomans.
Thank you. Anyone else from the Zoom audience? Questions, comments? If you have a question, please raise your hand, or your if not, while you are thinking, I can comment and ask questions, because it's very, very similar what you have in Hungary throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. You know, the languages, Hungarian as a language between the Austrians and the Ottoman Pashas, and everyday life on the frontier really paints a different picture of the Antemurada. So at the same time, when a fortress commander in Hungary considered himself as a guardian of the Christian faith, he is negotiating with the other side. They are exchanging gifts. They are helping each other. They are asking the removal of certain Ottoman governors. And what you mentioned with regard to the building material of the Holy Trinity Church, even fortresses. You know, since Hungarian.
That was a fortress. Holy Trinity was the. It was,
Okay,
it was a fortress.
okay.
It was a
So
fortress.
you have that in Hungary, and it's very, very regular because the peasants under Ottoman rule, also the peasants of a Hungarian landlord who very often happens to be the captain of a fortress, and as part of the duty of his peasants is the labor that in the spring they have to go and help to build or reinforce or repair the fortress, knowing that there might be an Ottoman attack. And it is with the permission of the Ottoman authorities that whole villages go to a Hungarian fortress to reinforce it against the Ottomans. So really the border relations are paint a rather different picture of this you know, clash of civilization narrative.
When I wrote on my PhD over 30 years ago, I was fascinated with the Kanonname of the Eyalet of Újvar of Nowe Zamki that's published by Blaszkowicz, because there you have really that you have stone, and the stone, when you have not much stone in Hungary, apparently it must be in the Tatra in the upper Hungary in Slovakia, that was a part of the Habsburg Empire, but evidently the stone from Habsburg Hungary was crossing the border to the Ottoman Hungary.
And
so
iron.
Yeah, and iron, yeah,
yeah.
especially, yeah.
Which, if you look at the treaties or legal documents, those are marxist prohibited goods. You're not supposed to sell that, not supposed to provide your enemy, and yet it was the you know, it was everyday life that they did it with the permission of the commander, and they were paying for that, or they would let the peasants not pay certain taxes because in return they can provide either timber or iron. Yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples is just shortly before the Battle of Lepanto, the Polish king allowed large amounts of tin to be sold to the Ottomans. And you know, tin was used for, but of course, maybe we are today, like in 19th century historians were more focused on the war. So we are now, we look as historians, probably we are guilty of this, that we are much more fascinating with peace or elements of like human interrelations. So I'm asking myself whether it's not that we are in a way biased in the opposite direction, looking more for everyday life and cooperation. But it's really, even in 17th century, it's much more warfare oriented. There's a lot of everyday life in this.
I have a question about the priest and its congregation. So what is the story? Can you elaborate on that? Because I found it fascinating. So they wanted to cross.
No, it was not a congregation. It was just a parochial priest, a parish priest, and he wanted that he and his flock that they could pass to the Ottoman side, because he was afraid the Russians are coming. So please accept us. And they all try to go to the Ottoman side because the Russians are coming. So it's again asking the Pasha as an old friend, and please protect us. And they are sending their wives to the Turks. Because the Turks could protect them. So when we think about this today paranoia about the migrants from Islamic countries coming to Europe, so it's just another part.
Very interesting. Any other questions from the audience?
I mean, I kind of have a few questions.
Okay.
Andre Gronostayev here, University of Toronto now. I have two questions. One may be a little more about the archive itself. You mentioned the collection in the Russian Archive of Foreign Affairs. Can you speak a little more about basically what kind of documents they have about maybe townsmen and peasants who lived in the region at the time? Because you mentioned that there are very few documents on the peasantry, and I do study the peasantry myself, so I'm just very curious about actually what kind of everyday glance we can get from those archives and from those sources. And the second would be maybe like a side question. You mentioned the border commissions between the Ottoman Empire and Poland. I'm very curious about the border commissions actually between Poland and Russia in the 18th century. I'm looking at those commissions right now, and there were a bunch of those work in different ways. And I'm curious how effective commissions were between the Ottoman Empire and Poland, because the Russians always blame the Poles that those guys actually not really working effectively. They always find a way how to stall the commissions and always find a way how not to really resolve any disputes. So basically they're blaming the Polish side in this sort of intentional, intentional prevention of solving any kind of border disputes that were arising at the time. And they mostly pertain to migration, peasant escapes that were happening from the Russian side, some of them about the crimes, about raids that Poles were organizing to Russia at the time. So I'm just curious basically about how those commissions were working and whether they actually really show the interactions that were going on at the time and whether they were effective.
Okay, thank you. There are actually two questions. One, the first on the peasants in this area. So you can, when you look for peasants, it will be rare in the Ottoman documents. That's the documents that were addressed to the Pasha as complaints or as, there are not very many. My feeling is there. Actually, I remember it was in one volume. There were many of them. I was fascinated, but I had just to search through this volume in one day and give it back in order to order another one. So I was just doing a very basic search of it. And you are right. You will not find much documents on the peasants in the cross-border correspondence, apart from accusing each other of stealing peasants. So that was. Could you write me an email later afterwards? Because there are some colleagues whom I know that they are working on this on the Polish-Russian border. Well, most of the Polish historians who work on the 18th century are focused on the grand diplomacy, so not on the border things. But Petro Kłakowski, who is a Ukrainian historian, and he works in Ostrov, he worked on Chernigov on this area, but mostly from the early period, the 17th century period. One of the guy who is correspondent of Kolchak Pasha, Jabłonowski, he is a starosta of Chechrin, and he had some traumatic experience with the Russians. He hates Russians. You can see it from his letters, and you have some Cossacks also who are going here and there. So I'm quite aware of these conflicts that were on the between Russian Ukraine and Polish Ukraine in the 18th century. So please just write me an email, and maybe I will be able to answer more in concrete, or put you in contact with some Polish colleagues who are working on the 18th century. Although we have the school of Zofia Chylińska, and there are many younger colleagues like Dorota Dukvich or Urszula Kosińska, but they are, as far as I know, they are research. They are much more interested in grand diplomacy in the capitals, although things like quarantine were also sometimes studied by them. So I can provide maybe more information later.
Okay, I will do that. And just maybe a follow-up question about this. So I'm not just talking about the Polish-Ukraine, this territory. Basically, the commissions were active along the whole border at the time in the 18th century. There were commissions in Novgorod, for example, like near Novgorod. Others were near Smolensk. So basically, like, it's along the whole border situation. And I'm just, again, very curious about the effectiveness of those commissions, because my impression from the Russian archive, including this in Mid, the commissions were a failure. That's my impression. They were able to solve some minor disputes, basically maybe land disputes sometimes, but not always. But when you talk about some kind of mass issues or important issues, they completely were ineffective. And the Russians always blame the Poles. I mean, it's obvious. I only looked at one side so far. I don't know what the Poles are saying about that at the same time. But I got this picture in my head right now. So, and actually a colleague of mine and I, we are having an article published likely next year in Critica that is talking about the migration of Russians to Poland in the 18th century. So, but I'll write you an email about this, obviously. Thank you.
No, I would look at the Metryka Litowska, but I don't know. I was working in Metryka Litowska, but mostly on the 17th century, 16th century stuff. But there are also the volumes from the 18th century, and probably because it's the Lithuanian point of view, so it would be much more about the border conflicts, or the Czartoryski archives that is in Krakow. When you have, there's an old book by Serczyk about Czartoryski domain, so there might be some private conflicts. But it was important. So this conflict were important, and of course each other blamed the other side. So it's normal. If you're in Russian archives, usually it will be the Polish side that will be.
Obviously, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrzej. Anyone else from the Zoom audience? So, if we, guys, any question?
I have a quick question. So when like these nobles and the like the garrisons in the fort, when they're making these connections, like are they ever meeting in person very much, or is it almost always through like correspondence and letters?
They have meetings incredibly many times. Actually, Świrski, you saw that even their wives, they send their wives over the border to do shopping in Hotin and to visit the harem of the Pasha. So if I think if I were to send my wife or my daughter to the Ottoman side, I would have preferred, like probably before I would have been myself. And they are friends. We have Philip Orlik. I do not enter much in the Ukrainian stuff here because but Philip Orlik was one of the most important correspondents of Kolchak. He was an exiled hetman of Ukraine, the successor of Mazepa, of Ivan Mazepa. And Orlik met Kolchak first time when he was returning from Sweden to the Ottoman Empire. He didn't know that he would be interned by the Ottomans for many years. But so in 1720, 22, I think, he spent 2 weeks or 3 weeks close to Hotin in Rumel, this neighborhood of Hotin, and he was ill. So Kolchak in that time was not the Pasha. Kolchak was a colonel. He was providing him herbate, which is tea, one of the first mentions of tea. So the Turks were giving tea to Ukrainian hetman coming from Sweden. So we know that they meet each other, that they pay visits. Whether Kolchak, I didn't have any letter to my knowledge now that Kolchak would remind that he was in Kamieniec or that he was on the Polish side. He might have been, but I cannot be sure. But some of his correspondents were coming. They involve their their conversation, their private conversation. Like Potocki writes, I cannot write more now. It's during the war, Russians like that the post can be intercepted. But you remember we were discussing this when I visited you, or when my brother, so when Joseph Potocki, he was the top authority in the Confederation, in the anti-Russian Confederation. But he mentioned that when my brother, who was his cousin, Michał Potocki, visited you, we were discussing these secret things. So yes, the people who crossed on the other side, they often came to Hotin just to pay visits or honorary visits. So it's obvious. You have also the Lipka Tatars, and they serve on both sides. You know, the Lipka Tatars, the Lithuanian Tatars, they were Muslims. They served in Lithuania since the late 14th century. Some of them rioted against Poland-Lithuania and changed to the Ottoman side, but most of them remained. And we have in the 18th century, there are many cavalry officers and soldiers who are the Tatars, but some of these Tatars served on the Ottoman side, and they changed. They got money here, they got money there. So they have family on both sides of the border. So they are most natural contacts because they are Muslims and they speak Polish.
Thank you. Could you elaborate on the postal system? Because you mentioned that the French ambassador in Constantinople, when he wanted to correspond with his colleague in Warsaw, he used the Ottoman courier system. So can you tell me more about this? Because it's fascinating.
There is a classical article that I use myself by Colin Haywood about the ULAP system. Yeah. And he measured especially this part to Hotin and to Ochakiv, because actually there was the Ortayol going to Buda, you know, the left going to Epirus, and the right pole that was going to Ochakiv, and then either to Hotin or to the Crimea. And actually, already in the late 17th century, I calculated once, I studied the document, the Ottoman documents from Kamanice. So I had the date when a document was issued and the date from Istanbul when it was entered to the archive. And the shortest time that I remember was 20 days. So it's about 2,000 kilometers and a letter transported in 20 days, which is incredible. So usually we can think of 1 month, but sometimes it was, no, I think it was 10 days. It was 10 days. So 20 days would be just normal. So according to what Haywood wrote, is like 2 weeks or 20 days would be normal. But I remember there's one document that was like 10 days, that would be like 200 kilometer it just seems impossible. So probably the letter was the horses were changed, and the ulap could be even changed unless these people were really riding to the last possibility. So not only the French ambassadors, but we have also letters of the Dutch and English envoys in Warsaw who asked Kolchak Pasha to smoothen, to let them to use his network for their correspondence. So also the Dutch and the English diplomats in Warsaw were using the Ottoman system of ULAG. It was very fast and very secure to have this system of stations from Hotin to Istanbul.
We knew about the Messiahana system because of Haywood and others, but those are documents and they talk about this, how the system operated, but I didn't know that European diplomats were using it so widely.
Mariusz Kaczka found in Paris some documents sent by Monty from Warsaw, and it's interesting. Sometimes Monty sent the same letter through Danzig and through Istanbul, so we can even try to compare. What he didn't do it that much, which was faster, because the same letter sent like the Jesuits when they were selling, sending letter from Asia to Europe. Sometimes they use 3 times because 2 may be killed. I mean the envoys and 1 can reach the destination, but sometimes we are lucky and we have both letters sent. So the French diplomats definitely liked and used the Ottoman ULAG system, and apparently Kolchak, I don't know whether he was formally authorized by the port to do it, but he definitely used it, even for more private person. Joseph Scipion, one of his most frequent correspondents, who was an informal replacement of Jan Tarło, who was one of the top Polish anti-Russian partisans, and Scipion got post information from the Persian front. We have information that Nadir Shah is in Persia, so we have some information going to Poland about what is going on in Iran through the Ottoman ULAG system.
It's very interesting because in the 16th century it was the Venetian postal system which was used by everyone because it was so efficient. It seems that the Ottoman postal system was as important, at least in the early 18th century.
On land.
Yeah. Any questions? If we don't have any questions, I thank you again for this very interesting presentation, and thank you for the participants over Zoom. Thank you.